Hola, buenas tardes,
Hello,
bienvenido.
good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back again to Patrimonio en un Beat. This is the first panel out of the three panels that we will have during this encounter about digital preservation. It was organized by the Contemporary Museum and the Tecnológico de Monterrey. This first panel, which is entitled The Problem of Memory in Digital Collections, brings together different specialists in different fields of work. I would like to welcome all of you, and I will ask you to turn on your cameras and your microphones so that I can introduce you to them. First, I would like to introduce Isabel Bordes, who is with us all the way from Madrid. She is the director of the Library and Documentation Center of the National Museum. I'm hearing a background noise. Can anyone hear that too? Okay, I think it's over now. Thank you very much, Isabel, for logging in all the way from Madrid. I know you are not during your working hours, so we thank you. How are you? I'm good, thank you. It is a pleasure. Pedro Angeles is also here with us. He is a coordinator of the Information Center for Arts of the Aesthetic Research Center of the UNAM. How are you, Pedro? Good afternoon. A big hug to everyone. Ana Lucia Macias Chu is also here with us. She is the National Director of the National Heritage of the Tecnológico de Monterrey. How are you, Lucia? Good afternoon. I'm very well. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Thank you. And lastly, there is Damián Cabrera, who is here all the way from Asunción in Paraguay. He is the coordinator of the Documentation and Research Center of the Museo del Barro in Asunción in Paraguay. He is also part of the Conceptualization Center of the South. How are you? I'm very good, thank you. So for all of those who want to get to know more about the work that our guests do, you can go to our website. You can see all the bios of the guests we have here, of the panelists, and they are summarized bios. You will be able to see the full career, the CV of these panelists. And if you go to the website of Patrimonio en un Bit, which we are going to explore later, you're going to see a little activity that we organized for this meeting. Each and every one of our guests, of our panelists, sent a video in which they elaborate on the topics that we will be discussing this afternoon. In the panel section, if you go to the panel that we are on right now, you will be able to see the 4 books that we will be elaborating on, that we will be discussing this afternoon. I would also like to say that we're going to receive the questions that the audience sends from the Facebook website of the MUAC and from the YouTube channel as well. So if at any point in time you have a question, a doubt, a comment, you can ask, you can share it, and we're going to check them later. Now, without further ado, we can delve into the topic at hand. The main idea here is the memory in digital collections, and I would like to address it from different approaches and points of view. Firstly, I think an interesting idea that I would like to start off with is the historical moment in which digitalization emerges. So we're not in this point in time in which we are seeing these new technologies arise, but we are in a strange juncture. At this moment, there is a new reality of hybrid models. We see there are in-person or material collections and digital collections that are constantly being combined and coexisting. So I would like to ask you, from your perspective and from your line of work? What is the historical moment we are in? What is the progress of the digital collections that we see right now? What are the challenges that we still face? What are the digital gaps that Spanish speaking countries may find? Because in some cases, those challenges are very critical. And what are the gaps that we would have to start to bridge in order to succeed and in order to build collections and heritage that is that are more accessible and more democratic to everyone. So I would like to start by asking this to Isabel. What is your perspective about the juncture and the historical moment when it comes to digital collections? I think I would summarize it in a word: challenge. It may not be a very positive view, but
ese momento bisagra y ese
since we
entremezcla
have been seeing this reality and this juncture for quite a long time,
lo digital ha sido una
I would
oportunidad.
see it as a challenge.
Empezó por ahí,
Digital content has
sobre todo
been a
bibliotecas,
reality
los
for
bancos
quite a long
digitales,
time. We saw that in libraries. We
ampliando un
started
poquito
to
las posibilidades de difusión, de
transform.
literatura que suponía
We started to
y nos
see
alegra mucho
the opportunities that it
conocer
meant for
el
accessibility.
reto que suponía aprovechar esa oportunidad, porque
And we were always aware of the
como
big
del país
challenge that it was,
aislado,
but we
¿no?
made the most of that
La cultura
opportunity.
cinematográfica,
It
¿no?
has also been the case with
Ciertos
paper
ciertas
and
expresiones
with movies, traditional
lo
ways
digital
of making
me
movies.
parecen muy ciencia
And
ficción,
it is the same case for
creo que llevamos
digital transformation. There is a lot of certainty tied to that
nos
topic.
cuesta transmitir este doble mensaje a nuestras instituciones y a nuestros
And I think
responsables
it is difficult to convey this
de
message
darles
to our
realmente
institutions and to
su
people
puesto
in general.
en
It
un
is
reto y una
difficult
imposición
to
que va
convey
más
to
allá
them that
de la
digital
imaginación y de la
transformation
esperanza
also comes with a lot of challenges, challenges that go beyond
porque hay que hacer
the
muchas otras cosas
putting
y
into
lo
place
decimos
of these
muchas veces.
technologies.
De nada vale la actitud pasiva,
As I
¿no? de
said during the
autoconservación,
presentation, we shouldn't have
que es
a
una,
passive attitude
unas condiciones de
towards
seguridad y de
digital
temperatura
transformation.
constantes
It's not
a
just
largo plazo,
considering the
para
conditions
sobrevivir
of
y por tanto
temperature or the
necesitar,
conditions
no tenemos
of
ni idea de
something
lo que va a
to
suponer,
for
¿no?
something to thrive.
Entonces hay que ser muy proactivo, muy activo y
We
tenemos
should
que
be
tomar
very
la
proactive.
oportunidad
And
de
I
lleno
think that this
de esto y
opportunity
no siempre
involves
tenemos
a
la respuesta a ese
challenge.
reto, pero hay que
And we
ser
not always may have a response to that
saber
challenge,
que esta oportunidad que ofrece lo digital
but
conlleva
we
un
should
gasto.
be able to sell this idea, right? That
No
the
está
digital transformation may involve some
es
costs
uno de
that
nuestros
sometimes
objetivos
people
realmente
are not willing to
y
assume
bueno, no
and
sé si
take
quiere
on.
que hable también de los avances, de
I
las
don't know if
agendas,
you want me to
como
talk about
comentaba.
the progress and the gaps that you
Avances,
mentioned.
pues avances es que
There
estamos
have
hablando,
there
¿no? De
have
retos,
been
prueba es un evento como este, ¿no?
many proofs of progress, and I think an
Que
example of
habla
this is a
directamente
moment
que la
and
evolución
a space
tecnológica
like this that I applaud
puede poner
and
en
I
marcha
envy in a way,
y de
because this
posibilidades,
has been
¿no?
a great
Estamos
effort for
a pie
you to bring
de
together
sitios tan
people
diversos
that live and work in
y que
different
esté hablando de
places.
esto ya es una muy buena señal.
The sole fact that we're talking about this is a very good signal. And I think that this is one of the
Fechas e inconvenientes
biggest
diría que no
progresses
se
that I have
presentan
seen.
en Latinoamérica. España
Also, these inconveniences that you mentioned are not just present in Latin America, they are also here in Spain, for example. We have been able to see problems
una necesidad de inversión a futuro de la
not
preservación
only
digital
when it comes to managing the files, but also when it comes to budget and to funding.
luego además
And I think that those issues are present in many places.
o retos también nuevamente porque el problema
There are
probablemente
also
sea muy similar
challenges, not so much problems,
que en el tema del arte contemporáneo en el
that
campo del arte
involve, for
contemporáneo
example, contemporary art.
a veces perdemos uno de los grandes valores de la
Sometimes
preservación digital que es agarrarse a los estándares
we lose sight of the fact that
el
digital
arte
transformation
contemporáneo
can bring about
no
many
reconoce
benefits.
estándares no
For example,
reconoce
contemporary art does not recognize standards or labels.
bueno muy
It is
radical en
very
su
radical in a way,
no acepta ser etiquetada y por lo tanto no se lleva bien con los
and it
estándares y
does
los
not want to
estándares es
be
una de las
boxed
grandes
in, and it does not get
realidades
along very well
de
with
la
digital
preservación digital
transformation, I think. And I think this can be a challenge, as Miguel mentioned at some point. One of the greatest challenges in Latin America has had to do with digital transformation. He talked about digital transformation as a clinical history of our files in order to understand what may happen to them in the future or how we will face some challenges in the future. So, of course, having files will allow us to respond to the problems and the challenges better. And I think that's all. I'll leave it at that. I would like for my colleagues to comment on this as well. Something that I found very interesting from the video that you shared with us was that you talked about building a heritage with a proactive approach because specifically contemporary art poses those challenge of non-labeling practices. So how can we foster these structures in which we can collect, not just transform digitally? That's what you mentioned in your presentation, and I wanted to go back to it. Now, in regard to this proactive approach, I would like to hear from you, Pedro. What are your comments and your opinions? At the Institute, we started to digitize 20 years ago, and we have had a hard time to understand over the years that we have to go from digital transformation to digital documentation. What does this mean? This means that a conversion process is useful and it has many advantages, but if it is not linked to the contextualization amid technological infrastructure, because this is a medium in which the art and the content is being shared.
Sido mucho como, no sé si recuerdan ustedes
In this
aquellos de
process, well, I don't know if you remember these videos that delved into the origins of aviation. There are plane models that go up in the air and then they come down because of many failures. I think we are at that point. There are many uncertainties, many failures, of course, but there are two challenges towards the future: the creation of technological and human infrastructure. Human infrastructure has to do with having people that specialize in these topics, information technology, computers. And I think that computer science has allowed us to create a more transparent membrane between humanities, arts, and sciences.
esta es una cuestión
And
permeable que se
nowadays, we can see that this permeates and is translated into constant exchanges. That's why we talk about long-tailed disciplines. Those were disciplines that didn't use data at all. But nowadays, using data in our disciplines is imperative. However, if Isabel mentioned so rightfully, we need to have metadata with high quality standards. Otherwise, we're going to make efforts to no avail, and they are not going to have good results. We also have to talk about the gaps that we see in our countries, especially in Latin America. And this is an analysis that I could elaborate on, and we could maybe extrapolate this situation to other places. But our institutions in Mexico and in many Latin American countries operate from a place of precariousness, of austerity. And this means that the phenomenon of access needs to be opened up with viable technologies. What do I mean by this? Technologies that are very well thought, very well designed, that consider these realities. Training human resources is imperative. I have always thought that people who know how to handle these type of content are more valuable than technologies. And sometimes this change in the model is very difficult for companies. Knowing that they have to invest in digital transformation is very difficult for them. This has to do with public management, with public institutions, and this, of course, has an impact in digital transformation. We should know that this, the bottom line of this are the people who work on the structures, who create the structures and the technology and the relationships. And Isabel mentioned many challenges, and I agree with her. There is great uncertainty when it comes to digital transformation. Digitalization poses many challenges, even if we navigate towards preservation models. These models are still very hard to implement because they are very hard to get to know. They involve a wide and a broad area, a broad territory, and we're still figuring out how to create data with high quality. This topic that you mentioned regarding infrastructure and digital gaps has to do with this capability of democratizing because digital platforms can allow for this. And Ana Lucia, I know that you have many years of experience as director of the National Library. So could you give us your perspective? Could you give us your opinion on this digitalization framework?
Donde se subraya
Yes,
la
of course. I think we are at a juncture in which the importance of digital transformation is highlighted. And there are different sources of information that come into play. And as my colleagues mentioned, this, of course, is a great challenge, but it is also a big opportunity for us. I consider that among these opportunities that we have, no matter if it's from a museum or a file or whatever, in all those places, we can see many progresses, many milestones. And in a repository, we can have well-organized information. My colleagues have talked about this, about how we can have organized information that also has records of cultural information. On the other side, having only one point of access is important. It's important to talk about this topic because at this point we can have access to information resources in different formats. And this is thanks to digital transformation. This is a very important event that we are experiencing. We can recover our memory through audio files, through video files, and this meeting even favors and makes it easier for us to preserve files. Another thing that I would like to highlight is how we give visibility to authors, to materials, and that is something that every institution is interested in. Every institution that has a file or a collection of files needs to be interested in this. We need to see how we can democratize information no matter where I'm at, no matter if I'm working at a university, at a museum, or at a library. So I think it's important to frame this as progress, as a milestone. This era has allowed us to be aware of the importance and the opportunities that digital transformation brings about. Lastly, I would like to mention the gaps. A gap is the access to information, the way in which we can interconnect files to institutions. How do we manage to direct our efforts? How we can connect so that research is fostered and promoted. And this is part of the memory that we are going to create. Thank you very much, Ana Lucia. Damian, just to wrap up this first topic, I would like to ask you about the juncture, right, that we mentioned. But What is your vision as part of the network that you are a part of? Because that is an activist network.
Una práctica activista de la
So
documentación.
how do you use or how do you perceive digital transformation as an activist? Well, this organization has been working with files and projects that are related to files for more than 10 years.
De accesibilidad a infraestructuras o recursos, incluso formación técnica.
We have had many issues related to resources, to information, to infrastructure. We have worked with projects that are not institutional too. We are seeing a point in time that has many advantages and many opportunities because many resources have been democratized and they guarantee accessibility to everyone.
Precisamente algunos de estos proyectos que ha trabajado Loreto
Again, some of these projects,
son,
some of the projects that we have worked with do not involve infrastructure or many technical data or many resources. However, we collect files anyways, and sometimes the collection and management of files comes with a lot of ignorance. So we need to get to know more approaches and more practices to build artistic memory.
ante ya sea la falta de conocimiento
For example, due to the lack of knowledge about codes or standards in relation to the management of files, we have seen the creation of incorrect codes, for example, or incorrect information. In that sense, contextualization in files is poetic in a way. We work with many files that come from artists or politicians, political activities. And of course, all of them pose an opportunity to us, but they're also a challenge, how we can access these files. Sometimes the formats and the codes are not harmonized, so we need to learn the codes and the keys to every file.
sino que creo que en general la práctica archivística frente
I
a
also think that archiving
frente por un lado a las demandas del mercado y a la fuerza que tiene
meets the demands of the market or responds to the demands of the market. And the trend is towards getting files that have great value.
las obras de arte contemporáneo
And as you mentioned, contemporary art
herramienta para democratizar
is a widely discussed topic at the moment.
y dar accesibilidad a ciertos
Digital transformation has allowed us to give
inclusive ahora en una era
people
en la
access to many
que
files.
se abre por ejemplo a los tokens no fungibles, ¿verdad?
For example, we see now tokens. That's a very important topic at the moment. And we see that files are also a very interesting element of the market. Now, going back to you, Isabel, before giving you the floor, I would like to raise two ideas before I move on to the next question. Firstly, all this precariousness idea, the austerity that Pedro mentions is interesting, right? And I would like to talk about that. And I want to connect that to what Damian mentions about the possibilities that this brings about. You framed this in a very interesting way. You said that this brings the possibility of creating new categories, categories that may come in poetic ways, as you say. This is very interesting because it segues into the second question. Isabel already raised the topic of the risk and the challenge that collecting and archiving contemporary art poses, because it is in itself very reluctant to digitation. But also the file can be an artistic practice in itself, or it can be a reflection of a poetic or artistic practice, as Damian says. So Isabel, I don't know if you wanted to talk about this and that's why you raised your hand, but now I would like to ask you about this.
Al oír a mis compañeros y quizá por ese, lo de romper a veces el hielo, se me han olvidado dos cosas importantes.
I forgot two important things. I didn't mention them at the beginning.
Una, que la estandarización, aparte de ser aliado, también puede ser un enemigo.
Standardization can be an enemy, not an ally so much because of what Pedro mentions. Because, for example, if you turn to literature and you start to get to know about the standards in relation to audiovisual formats, we hear very technical terms and formats, and sometimes these terms paralyze us, and we know that the layman wouldn't be able to understand this and would be intimidated by them. So, of course, standardizing poses a great challenge, and we need to opt for not standardizing at some points. And there is a great gap also that we need to work on, especially when it comes to contemporary art, and it has to do with intellectual property and its legislation. We know that digital transformation has many advantages, but it also has many difficulties because sometimes it hampers the acknowledgement of the creators of people, right? Or sometimes the dissemination of content is hampered by the regulations of intellectual property. So, for example, there are libraries that are protected by these legislations that rule intellectual property, and sometimes they are not part of these conversations and they are not part of these projects that allow to democratize information. So we are in an ever-changing context in Europe. I would like it to be more transformational. There is a committee which talks about digital transformation issues, and it has not opened up as many doors as we would have liked to. I just wanted to mention this very quickly, this in relation to the gaps. I also think that the idea that Damian brings to the table is very interesting. We should frame digital transformation as a poetic and artistic practice, because sometimes these new ideas are more pragmatic and are more useful, because sometimes people who are not very savvy when it comes to technology will be overwhelmed, and we need to have people who are specialists on this and allow us to understand and to make decisions and to be more pragmatic. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, we need to come with gradual solutions because there is not a universal solution for this. We need to get gradual responses from people who are actually specialists. I don't know if that responds your question. Yes, yes, of course. And I also think that, as you mentioned in your video, we need to understand that when we build digital collections, we are entering a continuous learning and continuous improving process. It's not like we're going to have the best collection with the best and the most accurate metadata. This continuous improvement process can be a trigger for having these collections or for having these interactive collections that we see so frequently. And Pedro, this is related to what you mentioned in your video. You talked about platforms such as Zona Cero and other platforms. So do you see these platforms as creative platforms and why?
Es genial y la verdad es que cuando él dijo que los artistas llegaban primero a los
Well,
problemas,
Pedro is great. And when he said
creo que tiene
that
razón.
the issues are
Él entró a la digitalidad de lleno,
getting in touch with us, I didn't believe
alguien
it.
nos ha preguntado
But
muchas
he
veces, ¿es un
fully
archivo
committed
definitivo si hace
to
una
digital
retrospectiva para lo
transformation.
inmediato o para lo
I
permanente?
don't know if he has worked
Y ese camino
focusing on the long
es
run
recorrer
or the
él
short
como
run.
artista que está
But,
liderando la digitalidad
anyways,
y todos
that
aquellos
path that he has
artistas y
to
lugares
go
y
through as an
museos que
artist
tenemos la responsabilidad
is a
todos de
path that
cooperar.
we all should
O
go
alguien que
through.
pasó de lo análogo a lo
Museums,
digital por procesos,
specialists, we know
tienen
that
claro
many
que tienen que llevar
institutions
una
have
esencia
transitioned
completamente digital.
from
WordPress dice que
analog
when
files to
Word is
digital
poetry,
files.
code is poetry.
We have seen phrases such as code is poetry,
Eso puede pasar.
and I think that that is
Todavía
true.
vemos en un territorio incluso tan eh, árido para algunos como
This may be a very arid territory, right?
y
Codes
ahí la vamos a
are
encontrar
very difficult for many people, but there is beauty in that process, and we're going to find beauty in those learning processes. And I would like to go back to the membrane idea that I shared with us. Sciences and arts and humanities are going to coexist more in the future, and that's very good because I haven't heard digital biologists, I haven't heard about digital physicists. Why? Because those disciplines have been intertwined with computer sciences, with technologies, and in the arts and in the humanities world, this is a novelty, right? This is something that we have just started to do. So we need to start working from a place of training, from a place of getting people who are specialists in the topic. We need to create these types of networks. And heritage, of course, always wants to disseminate. And to disseminate, transformations take place at a very slow pace. We are located between two walls that are very difficult to penetrate. On the one hand, we have this information privacy topics, all these protections that should be guarantees in citizenship and citizens' freedoms. And on the other hand, we have the other wall, which is intellectual property rights. But in between, there is a gray area. And in this great area, we can start disseminating and we can start working around how we come up with websites that make a photo viral in a matter of seconds. So yes, I think that this network is a great utopia, but it is mediated by big companies, corporations, states. It is a utopia, that's right, but it is born from a wide array of interests and agendas, and we know that Facebook has created great profit thanks to the metadata that we provide to it. And we should start asking when and where are we going to formalize the memory of our current era? Are we going to put it in the formats that we are using now, or are we going to put it together as the Congress of the United States has? We need to start thinking about it. How are we going to collect the files that will represent our current era? And we need to keep working on it. Ana Lucia, according to your experience, since you have worked with cultural heritage at the Tec de Monterrey University, where do you think the creative possibilities and opportunities lie when it comes to these platforms? I think it all can be put down to interdisciplinary work. Listening to different voices, to different inputs and reflections is very important. And that can allow us to put together like a mosaic to preserve memory. Thanks to an interdisciplinary type of work, we can reach a common middle ground. Of course, we need to listen to the person who creates the catalogs. That's very important to organize the information. But we should also listen to the visual artist that wants to reflect that art collection in the repository of the institution. And we should also consider the different descriptions that other people may give, because those comments and those inputs are very rich. This can allow us to share these works and these objects. That should be the aim of art collections. Same thing for document collections. We need to find a way to understand, because I think that cultural heritage can be perceived and read through many angles and through different perspectives. And I think that's where the richness lies. We need to have a repository with different perspectives. Okay, now, Damian, I would like to hear more from you about these poetic codes and about the categories that we may have, because that's very related to what we mentioned earlier, to creativity, to the potential of archiving.
Quizá puedas contar una anécdota de un archivo
I could start off
la
by
digitalización de
telling you
archivos
an
que
anecdote.
va a pasar a integrar ahora
We had a
una cosa que se
project
llama archivos
that
físicos,
focused on digital
donde
transformation here in Paraguay,
disponibilizamos
and we tried to put
documentos,
together a web in which we digitized videos, images, different types of content, and we had to contextualize the files in political, artistic, and historical formats.
proyecto de digitalización del archivo de dos artistas, se llama Cara, el archivo
We started to digitize the work of two artists. Alfredo Sagma was one of them.
está albergada en ese archivo,
And we started to put together all the documents. And it was basically poems and texts written in napkins and separate sheets of paper.
el archivo, y teníamos como la posibilidad de escribir y clasificar
And we had the possibility to classify and to organize this information according to different standards. And I felt like many standards
documentos.
could simply be left out. They did not apply.
Entonces decidimos incluir unas palabras clave
So we decided to include some keywords, additional keywords in every document,
cosa en cuenta más poética que ya está
so that we could
entonces
have a more poetic code.
todos los textos que fueran bibliográficos
For example,
de las vidas de los artistas,
we used biographical data for many artists, and we tried to put it together in another section.
vidas que eran narradas y contadas
We
archivo, además
considered the lives of the artists. We put all that information there, and we try to organize the events in different categories. This is also a very affectionate document because it talks about the friendship between Alfredo Sepe and his teacher. And we also created another category, which is called Novela de los Efectos, Effects Novel. And in that category, we put information and documents that talked about this letter relationship, right? They had a relationship between letters, and we tried to portray that in that file. And we wanted that file to go beyond its material characteristics, its physical, intangible characteristics. We wanted it to transcend that. We also made available other documents, other files, And every file started to propose its own keys, its own codes. Some of them narrated historical events, and they needed to have an additional categorization. We didn't just want to guarantee that people could navigate through the file properly in a fluent way, but we also wanted the user to read the narrative codes and keys in every document. And that added value to the document, of course. In this way in which we organize and digitize documents and files is very artistic, and it has allowed us to be very creative. What you mentioned is very interesting because it seems like there is tension between what can be standardized and what falls outside or is on the fringes of standardization. And I think that is also related to what Isabel mentioned at the beginning. She talked about the constant process of reconfiguring. So one last round of questions before we move on to the Q&A space for the audience. I would like to talk about the main idea of this roundtable, which is memory. Digital collections, of course, allow for the memory to take place. And we should not forget the social perspective and even the political perspective of these digital collections. So, Isabela, in very broad terms, what type of memory can and should be built in a digital transformation, given that not everything should be collected, not everything should be archived? So how can we decide what things we should keep and what things we shouldn't keep? Maybe from a political point of view or historical point of view. That's a very difficult question, but I think it comes from the creativity space that Ana Lucia mentioned. We should bring together different voices. This decision regarding what we should keep and we shouldn't keep shouldn't be just made by one person. For example, the department that I work for is very aware of this. We shouldn't just listen to the artist that created the work of art or the Bolvoster work, which is something that I mentioned during the presentation. We should not just keep the voice of the artist, but we should also keep in mind the intention of the artist back then, why that person wanted to recreate something in another medium. For example, in the case of TV, television content does not have much of an impact right now as it had in the past or as other media have. So the creation of these collections need to bring together different voices, different processes. We need to check how financially viable a collection is, how many solutions we can find to a project. We should consider, for example, the family of the artist, the social context of the work of art. For example, in the case of the work of art that I mentioned, maybe it was intended for television, but how can we find a way for it to have the same impact on another medium? So we need to have plurality. We need to have many people involved in these processes. And to me, that is a challenge because I represent in a way the library that I work for, but I also represent the Digital Solution Center. So as I told you earlier, there is a great need to make an analysis, a cross-cutting analysis of the whole institution. On the one hand, we have computer scientists, we have the restoration department, we have the budget department, and we need to understand that collections come from many places. We need to see what hasn't been transformed digitally, what has been transformed, and we need to have a dialogue, a discussion with our colleagues. We need to see in which category these collections may fall under. Maybe there was a collection that was digitized a year ago, another one was digitized longer ago, and maybe we used more cutting edge technologies for one work of art, and for those we didn't use many modern processes. So we need to consider all these characteristics and all these conditions because there is, as I mentioned, great diversity, great plurality, and there are different implications. So we need to keep in mind that we should consider computer scientists, restorators, preservators, all these people.
Me interesa mucho tocar más adelante lo que mencionas de los archivos que ya
I
nacen
would
de
like to
manera
go back to what you mentioned about the files that are born digitally. And that is related to a question that the audience asked. But before I go into that question, I would like to ask you, Pedro, what is your perspective and the Institute perspective about the keeping of memory in this juncture? What are the social implications and the political consequences of this process?
Siguiendo un poco lo que Damián nos ha expresado,
Going back to what Damian shared, thanks to efforts like those, we have increasingly more online resources available. And this, without a doubt, promotes access and promotes reflection and promotes the relationships between different realities. And this, of course, is a great advantage of digital transformation. But going back to the standards topic that we discussed, they should be guidances. They should be like the best practices that guide us. We know that descriptions are relevant in order to make connections between collections or between different entities.
en buena parte de sistemas,
So
de
descriptions depend greatly on catalog rules, on standards. They depend on many elements that we need to consider and we need to keep learning about them. And the bottom of all of this touches 2 points, I would say. We talked about diversity in the past. So I would like to talk about this idea of diversity, of art being heterogeneous. We see many types of files, many types of content, and that extraordinary variety that we see
¿Es computacionalmente capaz de ser integrada?
is a challenge. We should ask ourselves, can we integrate this diversity and these differences from a computer science point of view? I know there are programs and platforms that allow us to find a common ground. We can sometimes combine the real world and computers, but do we have enough resources and do we have enough infrastructure? This has to do with expectations and aspirations. We've talked about access, and that is a challenge, but we should also talk about this guide of good practices. We should create and come up with data that have high quality. We have proposed in the art world for data to be accessible, to be concise, and that's why we need standards. We need to understand this dialogue between the real world and computers. We are very familiar with the languages of poets, of artists, and we need to see this web, this network, as a pathway that allows us to see these amazing and this very great amount of resources and content. This is a risky future, I would say, but it is very promising too. So we need to convert reality with good practices, with a description, with a lot of hard work, and a lot of hard work, not just in relation to technical approaches or methodologies, or in relation to databases, for example, but also we need to work very hard in the descriptions as people who catalog and classify files. In this institute, we have tried to understand this wide variety of phenomena, of elements, of perspectives. These perspectives come from social practices, but sometimes we are overwhelmed by the plethora of initiatives and proposals that we see and that may challenge the way in which we work right now.
Incluso o
Pedro, as you
preguntas
mentioned,
filosóficas, ¿no?
this
Podríamos decir como
may
bien lo apuntalas,
force us to bring to the table philosophical matters, right? And this may make us question and wonder about our capability to integrate these very diverse media and this very diverse content. As you said, this standardization is like a social service, right? It should be seen in that way. It is a way to democratize information and to make it accessible to everyone, because otherwise, this information would be just a web of stimuli that serve no purpose. So, Ana Lucia, I would like to ask you about building memory. Pedro even talked about building future, and that is a very interesting notion. He talked about the social and political consequences and opportunities of a file. But in your case, Lucia, since you work in the university world, how does this topics come into play in your context?
Perfecto, no, me encanta que estemos conversando sobre
No,
esto.
I love this
Y
topic,
realmente
and
desde
I love the fact that
mi
we are
experiencia
raising
al estar
these
trabajando
issues. From
de
my
manera
experience,
colegiada con
since I've
colegas de
worked
diferentes
with
disciplinas
colleagues
en
that
nuestro
belong to different
repositorio
disciplines,
institucional, lo que se busca
in our
desde el
institutional
punto de vista de
repository,
nuestra universidad es
from
cómo
the point of view of this
preservamos la
university,
memoria
we
institucional
try
de alguna
to
manera.
safeguard
Es
the
decir, nosotros
institutional
cuando
memory.
estamos en estas
We
colecciones
don't just focus
de
on
arte
art
o del mundo
collections
antiguo, sino que
or
también cómo
antique
preservamos
collections,
todas las
but we
demás,
also
cómo
focus
podemos
on
decir desde
preserving
un punto
other
de vista
files,
académico, administrativo
academic
y demás.
files,
Entonces, al final,
administrative files as well.
desde el punto de vista de una universidad, lo que nosotros queremos
From the
es
point of view of a
promover el acceso a la
university, what we
información,
want to do is
el
give people
acceso
access to
y sobre
information.
todo
We
a
want to
la
promote
investigación
access to
y que se haga
research,
la vinculación
and we
académica.
want to have
Algo que también
academic linkage,
compartíamos
academic
en el
vinculation.
video
This
donde
is something that we shared in
escuchamos
the
las
video.
diferentes voces
We
de
heard
colegas
different
que
voices
participamos
of
en el
different
proyecto,
colleagues
donde de qué
that
manera este
took
trabajo
part
que
in
estamos
the
haciendo
project. We
desde
talked
la
about
universidad
how
logramos
this work
que se
that we
haga
conduct at
palpable,
the
que se
university
use, que
can
se
be made
consume
tangible,
en el
how
aula.
it can be
Y a
consumed
partir
and
de ahí
used
nuestros
in
profesores puedan
classrooms.
tener acceso a esta
We
información,
want our teachers
profesores
to
de
have
institución
access
y de
to this
otras
information, and
instituciones,
not just
y cómo
teachers of this
tendemos esos
institution,
puentes
teachers from
para que
other
estas colecciones
places,
dialoguen entre
and
sí.
how
Entonces creo
collections can
que
talk to one
el
another.
trabajo, lo que intentamos nosotros
So I
hacer
think that
es
what we try to
finalmente
do
que esa información que estamos poniendo a
is
disposición de
make
nuestra
this information
comunidad
available
vaya
to
más allá.
society in general and
Por
to
eso
transcend
insisto en la
this point.
importancia
We want this
de los
information to be shared.
repositorios como grandes preservadores de la memoria colectiva.
So we should see
Porque
ourselves
es
as great
importante que
preservators of
justo estas
collective memory. And that's why it's important to have spaces like this in which we can make reflections, such as the ones we have been making. Now, Damian, in your video, you mentioned that in the network of the conceptualisms that you work for, you talk about these topics in a political way. You see this process as a political process. So why is that?
O de digitalización o documentación han participado de la red son
Well, because
archivos
many of the projects
de
that the network has worked in
algunos de los que
come
aparecen
from
aquí son de los
activists,
60, 70 y 80. Tiene que ver con un momento particular en la
and they
política
have to do
sudamericana sobre todo,
with
que es
the
el momento
historical
en
and
que
political events in
existe
South
la
America.
hegemonía de las dictaduras
We
militares
saw the great domination of
en Sudamérica
military
y hubo
dictatorships
un gran
in Latin
movimiento
America.
activista antifascista
And then
en ese
after
momento
that, there was a great
militante
momentum
que se relaciona con las prácticas
in
artísticas
the
y muchos de esos
ideologies
archivos
that counteracted, in a
archivados
way,
o
those
guardados dentro de
ideologies,
ese
the
código archival
authoritarian
están
ideology. So we see mmany
documentaciones
activists there. So
archivos
curators and people
preservados
who work
guardados
in
por mujeres
archiving
servicios de
files
privacidad
have
policíacas
made great efforts to
o de
compile
privacidad del Estado a nivel
these
de
files that
los
have to
gobiernos
do with
estatales
power management from the government,
cuando eso
from
emerge
police
un
officers.
tiempo después cuando hay como cierta cierta flexibilidad como para
Later
mostrar
on, we saw
esos
some
documentos guardados por
flexibility
tanto tiempo
to
y
reopen
es
these
conocido, tiene
documents
una
that
imagen
were
poética
closed
que es
and
el
were
servicio de
confidential for a long
artisticos.
time.
Esos documentos que estaban
So
como
these
guardados en el
documents
polvo, almidonados, de pronto
that
tienen
were
que
just
ser
there, sitting around,
volver a
had to be
recuperarse y
reopened.
oxigenarse.
They had
Cuando
to
eso ocurre,
regain oxygen and
hay como un fenómeno de eco en el
they
presente
gain life
y
again.
justamente
So this echoes the present in a
en
way.
esos discursos, en
And
esas
these
acciones,
practices,
en esos
these discourses, these
actos de resistencia
actions
del pasado reciente,
of
hay como
resistance
ciertos
to
gérmenes,
the recent past
hay como cierta potencia que está guardada y que merece mucha
enabled
investigación,
us
sobre todo en
to
contextos en que
propel ideas. And I
la política tiene
believe that
mucho
these ideas need to be
mecanismos de riesgo,
revived in some contexts.
tiene también
The
ciertas
political
actitudes
context would be very different if these files
surgimiento
had
de
not been
movimientos
kept.
autoritarios y
We see
ciertos
at this
movimientos incluso
juncture
que
authoritarian
se
ideologies
podría
arising and
en
coming
algunas
up.
especificidades se podría llamar también de fascista.
And I think some
En definitiva,
fascist ideas have
son
been
archivos poéticos y
springing
hacen
up
un uso también
around
de
the
esos
world,
archivos
in Latin
poéticos
America too.
tiene que ver
So
también
yes, this is a political
generar una
work.
posibilidad de inscripción.
It has to do with
Cuando el archivo no tiene un espacio de
also
inscripción, el archivo
creating
muere.
an inscription opportunity.
Deviene
When there
mausoleo
is no
el
opportunity
archivo. Si no tiene
for
esa
a file
posibilidad
to be inscribed, it will
de
die.
revisitación y de activación
It
por
needs to be
distintos mecanismos,
revisited, it needs to
se
be
cristaliza, se oxida y
reactivated.
muere.
Otherwise,
Se
the
hace un poco con
document will
estos
fall
archivos,
into
este tipo de
this use
archivos
and will die in a way.
neurolingüísticos,
So
con
we
otros
have tried
que son
with these
llamados
technologies
por
to
los
revive
conceptualismos del sur,
these files.
acciones
Here
investigativas sobre todo, es
at
tratar
Conceptualismos del Sur,
de
at
reactivar y
this
devolver un
organization,
poco
we have tried to
a la vida y al presente
reactivate
esas
and
potencias
give
políticas y
back
poéticas que
to
están
the
albergadas en
presence
estos
these
documentos y en esas
political
archivos.
and
Para
social
mantener eso
ideologies
y
that are
en
enshrined
sintonía con
in
esa
these
idea de construcción
documents.
de comunidad,
And
lo que
also this has
nosotros
to do with building a sense of
una de ellas
community.
es frente a, digamos, a esa nuestra dificultad para construir
We
archivos
know that there is great difficulty
que
to
tienen que
build
ver con la
files following the
complementariedad
same
que existe
standard
también
that allow for
con otros
a
archivos y instituciones.
horizontality and that
Hemos
allow
empezado a
us to
trabajar
connect
también
to
en
other
políticas
institutions and other
de
files too.
alianza institucional.
So we have
Tratamos de garantizar
forged
también
institutional alliances and
tenemos la
partnerships
fuerza para albergar esos documentos, que esos archivos
in order to
tengan
gain
una
force
localización
to store these files.
vemos
We
que
want
en
files
las
to be
instituciones,
localized,
sobre todo públicas eso ha sido, y universitarias, eso ha sido posible. Y
and we've
particularmente
seen
cuando
that
se
this
da
is
también
a reality in many
en el periodo
universities and
2017-2018,
institutions. In 2018, there
llamado
was a
Común
summit in
de
Chile.
Archivos, que está
There
disponible
was a
en la web
call
de
for a
Digitalization.
common collection
Se
of
busca
files And the network that I work for took part in that. And we wanted to reach a pretty much universal understanding that promotes the standardization and localization of files. We wanted to create the proper conditions for people to have access to these documents. We wanted to have responsible agreements. We wanted to see which institutions and individuals and collectives needed to be involved. And we wanted to foster the archive imagination. And I think that this space is, in a way, an archive imagination space. I love how you bring about these very interesting ideas, how archives can die and fall into disuse and we need to revive them. You also talked about hibernation in your video, how some files have been hibernating for a long time and we need to awake them. Now, this question is open to anyone who would like to answer it. Damian, you talked about dictatorships in South America, and Mexico, of course, can resonate with this topic. There are some political regimes that want to censor documents so that that collective memory cannot be reactivated. So that makes me think that these political regimes, in some cases, are following patriarchal trends or ideas. For example, many female artists have been forgotten, have been forced to hibernate because we haven't seen files that account for their work. So there is another critical route that we see arising. So from your experience, anyone, what other pathways, maybe related to gender or to social memory or to dictatorships, can be reactivated through a standardization work and through collecting and archiving? How can we revive these ideas? Who would like to answer first? Okay, Damian, go ahead. Well, a week ago in Paraguay, a documentary was launched. It is called Apenas el Sol, so barely the sun, and it talks about the work of collectionists and people who dedicate their lives to archiving. And he compiles the memory of his community in cassettes. So he records, for example, chants, songs that account for the history of the community that went through a genocide during the 80s, 70s, and 80s. That town experienced genocide. And I think that these projects that aim to collect files are good not just for giving momentum to indigenous memory, but to build a memory about those actions and those events that have been silenced. And we see this in indigenous communities in Latin America. Yes, you're right. I think in countries like ours, we need to delve into these topics. Isabel, what about you from the perspective that you have working for the Reina Sofía?
Hombre, yo creo que, por ejemplo, las relaciones que ha mencionado Damián, ¿no?
Well, I think that the relationships that Damian mentioned are very important. The center that I work for is collaborating with the network that Damian works for. So we should constantly seek institutional support. And this is allowing us to have a conservation strategies. For example, there is one called many copies keep something safe. So it is this idea that we need to partner up and we need to have many copies and we need to build and forge alliances. Now, the routes that we can create are countless. The ideas that you brought forward are very interesting, Damian. I loved the way in which you spoke and the way in which you brought about the indigenous communities. I'm a bit more concise, a bit more pragmatic. You talked about standards, right? And I think standards prevent us from becoming islands. And I think that interconnection can be achieved through standards only. And those standards do not deny that we can relate through other words and other keys. You know, there is diversity, as Damian mentioned, and that is not a barrier, and they cannot be just denied and invalidated. You, for example, talked about historical events, you talked about letters, you talked about different keywords that we can use in order to relate different files. So for example, if you have a set of exchanges through letters, we can relate that to other letters that we have at a Mexican university, for example, at Tec de Monterrey. And this idea that whatever you cannot find on Google does not exist is very dangerous. Because yes, whatever we don't see, whatever is not written about, it seems like it doesn't exist. So the work that Conceptualismos is doing is paramount. I think you have used many techniques, you have associated yourselves with many other institutions. And I was reminded of the Library of Congress because they are putting together the chants of the slaves that were the precursors of jazz. They are putting together those files, those content, and they have been able to put the pieces together to bring that memory back. And if they hadn't done these activities, we wouldn't be able to trace the origins of jazz, for example. And as you said, standardization allows us to connect and allows us to stop being islands. And whatever we do not preserve, future generations will not know about. They will think that something did not exist if we do not archive it. Okay, thank you very much. Isabel, what other routes or pathways we can take so that we do not forget important events? Richard Gardner, the librarian of the Barnard Institute, says that data do not exist in nature. And I think that this issue that seems so simple makes us reflect about how the building of human knowledge is a meta characteristic, such as metadata. Now, the relationship between virtuality and reality forces us to think how we can decolonize heritage. We see, for example, initiatives such as the Dutch museums that give back objects to the communities that were the original owners of the objects and the artifacts. So how we can use metadata in order to understand the links that took place in old empires and old colonies. This dialogue will be seen increasingly more in the future. As Damian rightfully mentioned, these phenomena are ubiquitous, and the relationships that we forge based on the information that we see on websites have been around for a very long time. In the past, we used different media such as newspapers, letters, But at the end of the day, websites and social media and information technology make this exchange faster. Maybe not more efficient, but the exchange of information is faster. And I would say that there are lessons that we shouldn't forget. Just like Isabel, I consider that documenting rightfully from the museographic perspective entails creating context. And this is a very rough and very difficult work that never ends. This can be applied to metadata, to standards. This can be applied to pretty much any field of work. And I think that the only concern that I have is the following. I think that what will remain over time is the best structured metadata. So yes, I'm not talking about dozens of years, I'm talking about hundreds of years. Ana Lucia, we are talking about colonization, about removing the patriarchal approach to files. So what other routes or pathways do you see when it comes to your work? I would say that the content approach is very important. How we can preserve the different contents that we have. How we keep and safeguard these files. I think my concern is related to those files that were born in a digital format. But I'm also concerned about what's going to happen in the future. What are we going to leave to the future generations? So yes, that's my concern. How can we keep our day-to-day contents? What do we actually keep? What should we keep so that future generations can have access to that? And at the end of the day, a phrase that I would like to share is that whatever remains is what is kept together. So at the end of the day, we want to preserve that memory and we want to approach it through different perspectives. Yes, I love the phrase that you gave. It is by Edgar Morin, and I love that you mentioned it. Now, just to wrap up, I would like to go back to a technical issue that is also a social issue. You talked about files that are born in that way, in a digital way. Those are not files that we have to convert or anything. And this raises the question of how these processes are going to be transformed. How archivists are going to transform their processes and their knowledge, because digital files are fragile. And I think we're working against time, and we're running out of time in a way. I think that there should be a mediation work, a sensitive mediation work, as Isabel mentioned. There needs to be political and social considerations that come into play to address the technical matters and to also decide what we should and shouldn't keep. So yes, I would like to have a second round of participations about the challenges of updating formats and how this is related to building memory. Who would like to answer first?
Empiezo yo ahora. Las tecnologías de la información van a seguirse transformando. La ley del
Information technologies will keep transforming themselves. The Murphy Law will keep being around. We're going to see the consequences of this in many aspects. In a digital transformation environment, what matters is not the platform, it is the data. Looking at this territory of the professional training of people who can specialize in this is very important. We need people that can spearhead the transformation of the technologies that can address heritage. There is a web for the British Museum, and it is amazing. And we need to focus on building knowledge. And for that, we need to have webs and networks that can create relationships between different worlds. Because there is a great difference between the British Museum and the Jalapa Museum, not just in terms of distance, but in terms of knowledge. And we need to mitigate these differences. I think that best structured data are the data that will remain, and they will be part of our memory. Because yes, they depend on technology, but they do not depend on every technology. And we should have open codes. We need to go to development. We need to have innovation that puts a common ground to specialists and to heritage institutions. Those would be very good decisions. We should not just invest on big stakeholders, but we should maybe invest on the creation of websites. And I don't know, I think that Teinacan, that's an initiative for free software of the University of Brasilia, and it can adapt to the needs of different museums. It can adapt to different budgets. So we should take these types of opportunities and make these kinds of decisions. I think it's sad how we can always have projects and we can get into different funding opportunities. This is exceptional and this will not last a lifetime. If a grant, if a scholarship is given, the duration of it is limited. So we need to invest in people and we need to invest in how data are structured. That's better than specializing in specific technologies that will keep transforming themselves and that will keep changing and making our work more difficult. So we should have good preservation models. We should have more sense. We should have a clear logic, and that's going to help us organize our data.
Interesante cómo lo sintetizas, Pedro.
It's interesting how you summarized that, because you're saying that what will remain is not just the most structured data, but also the most open data. Ana Lucia, did you want to mention something?
Estoy totalmente de acuerdo con lo que
Yes, I
menciona,
totally agree with
Pedro.
what
Nada
Pedro
más
mentioned.
creo que la clave está
I
en
just think
mantenernos
that the
actualizados.
key
Al
is
final,
also
tecnología
to
está
keep
constantemente
ourselves up to
cambiando
date because technology
y
is constantly
aprender de
evolving,
innovación.
it's
Tenemos que
constantly
también
changing.
compartir
And we need
conocimiento.
to have a
Eso es
collaboration network
primordial.
that allows us to share common. That's the only thing that I would like to add.
Bueno, es que sería
What
una
about you,
referencia, no sé
Isabel?
si conozcan esta referencia, pero había un programa de
Well, there
televisión
was
bastante
a TV show for
de
children
acervos
when
que
I
se llamaba
was
La
a
Bola de
child,
Cristal y
and
decía
it was
todo
called
con
Bola de
anteojos.
Cristal,
Era
so
una frase
glass
que
ball.
constantemente estaban repitiendo y creo que
And they
lo
constantly
definen perfecto.
repeated
Las grandes certidumbres que tenemos
that
en este campo es que todo
there
cambia,
is uncertainty.
nos
And
vamos
the only
equivocando.
certainty is
Entonces,
that everything will keep
compartamos
changing.
los errores.
We're going to make mistakes,
Eso
so we
es muy
have to
interesante en la charla de
share
preservación digital
the
que
mistakes, and
divulgó
that's
en Julio,
something very
ahí en el Colegio de México,
important to know. There
de los
was a
compañeros de
meeting
la
at
Ecole
Colegio de
de
México,
Palma de Mallorca, que
and
es de
a
aviación y comunicación
colleague of mine that works for the aviation industry participated there, and he said that he talked about how the aviation staff, the aviation officials share their mistakes so that they do not make the same mistakes as their colleagues. So yes, I think that's also very interesting. That's very important. And as Pedro mentioned, we need to structure data with, I don't know, a Dexter file, with a flat file. We need to document our collections with whatever we have within reach, and over time, we're going to come up with better practices. But we need to keep ourselves up to date because everything will change. And we should sell this idea of digital preservation to our institutions, and we need to convey to them the need to invest in that, not just in the repository platform. It is not just that. That is just one of the perspectives or the components that come into play. Sometimes we need to get this through the fear strategy, right? We need to tell them, if you do not invest in this, this horrible thing is going to happen. Yes, it may sound a bit too harsh, but yes, we need to tell them that the opportunity of making something digital is not a mirage. We need to constantly sell this idea that the digital transformation is important and that we need to have platforms and we need to have all that.
Yo creo compartir los errores en torno a las colecciones de
I think
arte
that sharing mistakes is critical. Yes, and sharing mistakes in this field is just as important as sharing mistakes in the aviation area. Damian, do you have any comments? Yes, at the Reina Sofia, there was a seminar of common files for, it was called Files to Come. And it had to do with archiving imagination and with the future of what's going to happen to files. And we talked about the uncertainty that we have been facing, and we talked about whether there was a future for this discipline or not. And the name of that seminar is like a starting point to us. It is very dramatic and it is very traumatic, right? The starting point was the loss of a file. What happens when a file is lost due to a natural disaster, due to a fire? What happens in that case? We talked about the way in which digital transformation can help us bring this document back. So I would just like to wrap up by saying that alongside the digital transformation and updation, we need to be more speculative in terms of the collection of files. We have to anticipate scenarios with our imagination. And Pedro mentioned something, which is how we can archive and collect the files that are born digital. I think that in the case of letters, we have found a way to keep them. But what's going to happen to emails and to messages that we send every day? Last week, there was a meeting here in Madrid, a meeting of the network of museums, and the Ethnological Museum of Valencia shared a project about the preservation of the memes that came up as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. They also talked about the role that they played in keeping the spirits of the society high at such a difficult time. And I think that showed that the pathways and routes of the discipline that we work for are infinite. And we need to work today to transform the content that we handle right now into memory. We are managing the files that will be part of the history of future years. So yes, we are already building pathways and routes to preserve memory. And I thought that initiative, the meme initiative, was beautiful, and I wanted to see it for myself. Well, we can close with that topic, with the memes, and with your invitation to think about the future. Thank you, Pedro, Ana Lucia, Damian. Thank you, everyone, for your interesting inputs. To all those of you who are listening to us, you can visit the website of this organization. And remember that tomorrow we will have more meetings. We're going to have Lori Emerson with Cynthia Garcia Leiva, and we're going to have them talk about different points that we raised today. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you later.
Gracias. Gracias.
See you soon.
Hasta muy pronto.
Goodbye.
Hasta pronto.
Gracias.